So we're going to start by knitting the first stitch. So as always, the yarn is behind the needles. I'm going in from the left side, creating my cross, wrapping the yarn around, and then bringing the tip of the right needle forward. So we have our first knit stitch. So our next stitch is going to be a purl stitch. So this is the most important bit with rib. Once you've worked your knit stitch and you're going to work a purl stitch, you need to bring the yarn to the front. So when you're purling, you always have the yarn in front of you, and when you're knitting, it's always at the back. So when you're switching between the two, you need to move the yarn. So it's very simple. You're moving the yarn between the two needles. So it's very important that you go in the gap between the two needles. You don't want to go over the right needle. Oh, there we go. Sorry, my needle has just fallen out. There we go. So yeah, you don't want to go over that right needle. So if I just show you what will happen if we don't move it, if we forget to move it and we just start purling, it's going to go over the right needle and it's going to create this diagonal loop. You see that there? Now that looks like a stitch, but it isn't a stitch, and that's going to mess us up on our next row. So it's really important that you go between the two stitches, and then you can insert your needle from the right and purl your stitch as normal. So now we've got a knit stitch and a purl stitch. So we need to move the yarn back across to the back to work on next knit stitch. And so we're just going straight over to the back. No extra loops on our needles, it's just moved between the needles like that. And then we're going to knit the next stitch. And then exactly as we did before, that yarn has to come to the front and it has to go between those two needles just like that, and then purl the next stitch. So we're just alternating a knit stitch and a purl stitch and moving the yarn in between every single stitch. So if you can't tell which stitch you're going to do next, you can have a look at the stitches to read it. So I've just knitted this stitch. I can tell because I've got vertical legs coming down out of the stitch. This one is a purl stitch, and I can tell because it has a horizontal bar facing me. So this one is a knit with the vertical legs. This is a purl with the horizontal. So if you just have a look, you can work it out from your stitches. If you're not quite sure, you can count how many stitches you have on your needle. So you know you started with a knit stitch, so it's going to be knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. And then I'm going to move my yarn to the front again and purl my next stitch. So once again, now I've purled it, we're just going to have a quick look on that needle. And you can see we've got the horizontal, which means it was a purl stitch. So I've already moved my yarn to the back, and now I'm going to knit another stitch. And then move my yarn to the front and purl once again. There we go. So again, we've got the horizontal bump, move the yarn to the back, and then knit. So if you're not sure if you've moved your yarn yet either, then you want to look at the stitch, because if you've knitted, you know your next stitch will be a purl, so you need to have the yarn at the front. So if the yarn is still at the back, you know you haven't moved it yet. If the yarn's at the front, you've moved it already and you're good to go. If the yarn's at the front, then you've moved it already and you're good to go. So that's another purl stitch, another knit stitch, and then a final purl stitch. So because we have an even number of stitches, the first stitch of the row is a knit stitch and the last stitch of the row is a purl stitch. So when you're working rib stitch over an even number of stitches, then for every single row, you're going to start with a knit stitch. So even though we're starting a wrong side row now, you can see we've got the bumpy side facing towards us, we're going to start with a knit stitch. Now, if you have a uneven number of stitches, you would be starting with a purl stitch. So another way to tell what stitch you should be starting with is by looking at your stitches. So if we look closely here, you'll see we've got the vertical legs facing us on this first stitch and a bump on the second. So as before, that means vertical legs mean knit and horizontal bump means purl. So with these vertical legs facing us, I know we're going to knit this, and I know we're going to purl this one because it's got the bump. So I'm going to knit my first stitch, move the yarn and purl my second stitch, then move the yarn back and knit, move the yarn, purl, move the yarn, knit, move the yarn, purl, move the yarn, knit, move the yarn, purl, move, knit, move, purl, move, knit, and then move for the last time and purl. So now you can start to see those little ribs developing. So you should have neat columns of V's and columns of bumps. A couple more rows of rib. So you're starting with a knit stitch, and then we're going to do another row starting with a knit stitch. The more rows we repeat, you're going to see a more defined rib stitch pattern. And as you see, the rib stitch is a really stretchy stitch and it pings in quite a bit. So the fabric will be pulling a bit narrower than it was on the stocking stitch and garter stitch sections, as you'll see here. But that's completely normal. That's what we want from rib. That's why we use rib for things like edgings on hats. We want a stretchy edge. Then rib is the perfect stitch for that.